Mesdames et messieurs, dames en heren. Welcome to the opening night of the 7th edition of the Passa Porta Festival. This biennial of contemporary international literature will allow thousands of readers to meet over 100 writers, thinkers, poets, illustrators, musicians, and other artists in the course of a weekend. Tomorrow night, we will underline the cultural connection between the UK and the continent with a literary concert against the background of Brexit. It is a unique collaboration between Clara Festival, Beaux-Arts, and Passa Porta Festival, bringing together on stage the Aurora Orchestra and the British writers Jonathan Cole, Ali Smith, and Suleiman Adonia. I can tell you now, but it's best to switch off the mobile phone. That would be my last sentence, but... A reference to current events will be made during a lot of the debates, interviews, readings, and slam sessions on Saturday and Sunday. 15 different venues in the city centre of Brussels offer a diverse, inspiring, and sometimes playful program. Initiator of the festival is the International House of Literature. But a festival of this scale is only possible thanks to a strong collaboration between many committed partners. We are particularly grateful for the support of all the subsidizers and the media partners involved, and that of dozens of cultural colleagues who share our focus on literature this weekend. The Passa Porta Festival presents writers who concentrate on what is at stake in our day and age, and this is certainly the case with tonight's guest, Reni Eddo-Lodge. Her book, Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race, is a compelling indictment of structural racism. The book has just appeared in French, and Reni Eddo-Lodge's participation in the festival has been the lever for a Dutch translation, will be published this autumn by Polis. The book demonstrates structural racism at work in the UK, but it also questions our shared responsibility, a responsibility we want to take as a festival and as a literature house by questioning our own mechanisms and moving towards a more radical equality. This will be one of the issues addressed during the conversation Reni Eddo-Lodge will have on Sunday with Milad Negussi, Lorraine Bastide, and Dory Wilson. For the opening tonight, we asked Reni something different, to write a new text, a letter to her readers. They reacted so massively to her blog spot with the statement, Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race, that it resulted in an award-winning book. The reader is a leitmotif in the festival and also the starting point of tonight's conversation with the African-American researcher, writer, and cultural curator Dory Wilson. You all received a copy of the letter, and we would like to ask you not to open it until the writer does, so you can read it together with the author in English, French, and Dutch, but not out loud in your case. I truly wish you an inspiring festival and a great evening tonight. After the talk, we will offer you a drink to celebrate the start of the festival, and you can have your book signed. It is for sale here. And then I would like to invite you to join us in going to the Beurschouwburg, just down the street, where a poetry slam starts at 10 p.m. with lots of power on stage, thanks to Joël Sambi, Amira Saleh, Luca Aruli, Sephora Sam, and Samira Saleh. But first, I give the floor to our guest tonight, Reni Eddo-Lodge.
Okay, so how many of you opened the letter already? No self-control, people. I didn't open it, and I wrote the thing, so disappointed, guys. Okay. Can you hear me clearly, or do I need to bring this down? No. Okay. Oh, this bit? No, the one you have. This bit? Yeah, it's from that one. I think I've worked it out. Oh, I'm on the headset. Okay, cool. It has no bearing. Okay, people, this isn't a comedy club, so please be serious. Okay, so this is a letter to my readers. I started unknowingly writing what ended up being Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race when I was 24 years old, In many ways, the book is a snapshot of me at that time. I had a sense of urgency about me that many people in my life didn't understand. A big part of the drive that led me to writing my book was a deep discontent. The work of anti-racism feels like shadow boxing, like fighting ghosts. You are taking on ideas, beliefs, and attitudes. Anti-racism is not just a quest to change policies and electoral results. It's a quest to change hearts and minds. It feels like an insurmountable task. Readers, you've changed that for me. Each time I've spotted a person reading my book on public transport or tagging it in social media, my discontent has been somewhat eased. There's a real possibility that all I have done is pass on that sense of urgency and responsibility. But I do think it's better that we share it together. Transformative change comes from collective action. I thank my readers for both enthusiastically, yet unwittingly, taking on my deeply held cynicism about the world. It's unfortunate, but cynicism is a place that activism can take you if you're not careful. The temptation to retreat into small communities that understand you, rather than take on the world together, is so strong. Ideally, you need both, but without attempting to meaningfully challenge the world that you live in, you can begin to believe that nobody else will get it. You get used to being maligned and misunderstood. You can begin to believe that the lack of a wider understanding is not about ignorance, but malice. It's true that when you are pushing against the way things are, the odds will be stacked against you. Influential organizations that have the power to spread messages will not be staffed by people who look like you or think like you. It is an uphill struggle. The amount of personal sacrifice that I had to make in order to forge a career in anti-racist writing is not required from the kind of writer who is happy with the way that things are. But readers, I have you to thank for upending my activist cynicism. My book seemed to have worked like an electric shock. The urgency has proved contagious. People who I had never imagined being supportive of the anti-racist cause have thrown their hats into the ring. The book has allowed me personally to feel heard. I think it's had the same effect on some of my readers. Reading and writing are tools for understanding, and the feeling is unendingly mutual. I've been a reader longer than I've been a writer. I know how it feels to read a piece of work that totally resonates with you, that leaves you evangelical, pushing the work into the hands of everyone you know. I understand how it feels to be emotionally stirred, profoundly changed, and utterly devastated by a book. There's something special about the written word. It allows you to reach all depths of the human experience. When I was a much younger reader, I used to marvel at just how much I could learn from the narratives that I'd find in dusty, decades-old books. I thought of books as time capsules that had the ability to catapult you into the inner lives of strangers. I thought that that was incredible. I'm grateful to my readers for giving me the opportunity to begin to return the favor. Thank you. I'll sit down.
I'm going to be flashing back and forth with my glasses, so forgive me for that. Reni, thank you for your fabulous book and your letter. It's a really great opener, I think, for the discussion tonight and for the directives of the festival and how it's always a technical problem. Yeah, thanks. And just for giving me the opportunity to be here. Thank you very much. Okay. Reni, in this process of writing the letter, you ask your readers to engage in collective action with regard to anti-racism. But what I find compelling about your book is that collective engagement is driven by putting the perspectives and experiences of people of African descent and people of color at the center, and at that moment, in addition, making the demand for the collective action. Can you just talk a little bit about how you see that in relation to the audiences that have been reading your book, and how the reactions have been from the blog, from the post until now?
Yeah, so I think, you know, I've always been for collective action, but I don't think that needs to mean flattening power differences. And I think thus far in the progressive movements that I've attempted to be a part of, that has appeared to be the prerequisite, that we are supposed to flatten power differences in order to rally around a cause, and it becomes more and more difficult to try and rally around that particular cause if some people are saying, well, rally around our priority, but we won't rally around yours.
Yeah,
so, yeah. So for me, I guess writing the book was really to put the priorities of anti-racism, at least as how I see it, firmly in the center. It doesn't necessarily have to be the center all the time. No. As long as there is a broad understanding of what it means when we are working towards progress. And it seems like a time in history where the fight is multi-pronged. Yeah. And so we can't continue to focus on these things in a sort of single issue way.
Yeah, and I think in reality, I mean, what it brings up as well is that we just have to get to grips with the fact that, you know, human beings are complex, and the reality of everyone's existence is that it's multi-layered. Unfortunately, or however you want to look at it, in the discussion around racism, it's the fact that the complexity of white people has been, they have not actually looked at the level of complexity that's there, and the historical record that needs to be looked at in relation to the discourse and concerns and experiences of people of African descent and people of color.
Absolutely, and I think, like, if we think about it in terms of social movements, for example, the climate justice movement, we can talk about, and we can think about the fact that, you know, I saw the writer Naomi Klein speak in London recently, and she said something very pertinent, which was that there have been people in the global south shouting and screaming about the crisis for a very long time, and it's systemic racism that meant that their concerns weren't on the agenda until people from the global north started to speak about it. And so that's what I really mean about, like, bringing an anti-racist perspective to the work that you do. It doesn't necessarily have to be focused exclusively on anti-racism, but just sort of like bringing that perspective. And of course, if you're not involved in social movements, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't bring that perspective to your life or to whatever you're working on. So for me, that was really, the aim was to get that perspective on the agenda, like, first and foremost.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, in terms, I remember in September, I'll never forget it because it was so stark to me. It was the cover of the Economist magazine, September 1990, and they were talking about environmental issues, and Africa was not on the map.
Wow.
And so the irony, of course, is that now we're in this discourse about climate change and, you know, the necessity of everyone doing their part and blah, blah, blah. But, I mean, the people that have been suffering for decades and whose the sustainability of their lives has been put in jeopardy for the last 20, 30 years, have never had a voice in this discourse. And I think that's why these movements, in fact, in my opinion, are ineffective, because the people that are basically being impacted the most are not in the conversation.
Absolutely. And similarly, I don't know what the Green movement's like here, but in the UK, I remember once, a while ago, being invited to speak about the work that I do, long before the book came out. And it was an astoundingly white, I actually forgot to say where it was. It was the Green Party conference. The audience I spoke to was astoundingly white and incredibly hostile. And they'll always be ineffective if they don't actually want to take the concerns of people who are affected by racism seriously, but expect the same people to rally around the causes that they advocate for, you know? Because for some people, we're concerned about climate change and also other things like being able to access housing, education, employment and healthcare without discrimination.
Exactly. It's like in Black American vernacular, we say, when white people have a cold, black people have pneumonia. So it's like that. Cynicism. So you brought that up in your letter and your notice to the reader, and you wrote to retreat into small communities that understand you rather than take on the world together is so strong. And you know what? The first thing that came to my mind was being engaged with social media and what we've seen, you know, over the last now 3-4 years, and how it's been manipulated, but also just how it atomizes people, and it doesn't, it actually facilitates this kind of echo chamber approach to engaging in thought or discourse. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about what you think about the impact of social media, especially because in starting this whole process, it was in fact social media, but early in the process of social media. So it was very different, I think, when you started than when it is now.
5 years ago now.
Yeah, it's a different landscape.
It's like a blessing and a curse. I don't think I would have the writing career that I have without social media. At the same time, I think one thing that was very obvious to me, particularly when I was writing the book, is that the priorities of social media aren't necessarily the priorities of the day. Let's just say that. It can give you a very warped understanding of like what's important in the world, you know. And I think just in general, the internet, I think something that like activists can say around these issues is like, oh, just Google it. And a lot of the research that I did for the book is not available through internet search engines. It came from, you know, archives that were archiving material long before the internet, and also this stuff, there was no like manpower to upload these documents online anyway. And so I think that if we start and end our conversations and our research around these things on the internet, then we are limiting ourselves, you know. And I also think that, like, in terms of anti-racist work and writing in general, like, it's been amazing for me. I've learned so much from other writers, but at the same time, I think that it feeds into a little bit of a, you know, I learned loads from other writers 5 or 6 years ago. I can't say that that's happening now. I think that you get this sort of like weird individualist fame politics on social media, which I'm not quite sure is particularly healthy. It forces you to brand yourself or to brand the cause or to brand your writing, and I'm not really a fan. I actually just left social media for like 6 months last year, and nobody even seemed to notice, to be honest. I just left. I was like,
you needed
I
a break.
think for me as a writer, it's important not to take what people are talking about on social media as the news of the day, or even like the priorities of the day, or the priorities in which your work should be going in. And sometimes it can feel like you should do that because the community is so strong and loud.
Yeah, exactly. No, I watched your interview of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and that was really interesting because she's not on social media at all. And I think that it's really interesting how, you know, she's kind of pulled out of it. But, you know, when you become a certain being in the world, you know, people are still talking. So in a way, you know, when you have to take that time to say, you know, okay, I'm out, you know, busy yourselves, you know, talk amongst yourselves, I think it's a good thing, because I think that, you know, sometimes we just need to shut up and be quiet and understand where we are in the world.
Yeah, I think it can be confusing for writers because, like, I feel I'm doing the job that I do because I'm an observer. I like to sit back and watch, and it's why I, you know, was trying to do journalism for such a long time as well. And like social media, particularly if your writing starts to become well known, is not conducive to that. People are looking for you to say things all the time. So, and watching you rather than you allowing yourself to watch. And so that's why I left, because I was like, I'm not comfortable with this. People asking me, well, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? What does it matter, frankly? If I really think something about it, I'll write it down and put it in a book.
Or an article, or, I mean, you'll make it plain, right? People will know what you're thinking about, what you want to talk about, or what you think is important for that
Exactly, or I'll say it in an interview or something, you know.
Oh, indeed. Given the makeup of the book and the fact that you had to do quite a fair amount of research, what were you actually reading when you were writing this? I mean, I know you were going to archives, but I mean, of course, you kind of need to sit in a bath of some of it for a while and figure out like what's important and prioritize. And how did you?
Do you mean in terms of like what I was reading for leisure, or what I was reading for the book in particular?
No, for the book, in addition to the research that you were doing.
Pamphlets, reports, pamphlets, reports, political reports. I remember one report that I drew on quite a bit was the Newer Monitoring Project, which is an organisation in East London that used to organise, formed in the report I read was from 1984, and they used to just report on incidences of police violence, because they reckoned that nobody else was going to do it. So I read that thoroughly. I drew on that a lot for the report. Like political pamphlets talking about, you know, black people in the Labour parties and Labour Party in the late 80s. Loads and loads of police magazines from the 80s as well. What else was I reading? Books from a self-taught historian in the UK, black British man named Stephen Bourne. There was a pamphlet that he'd sort of written to be published in South London and to be distributed to school children about Dr. Harold Moody, who is compared to Britain's answer to Martin Luther King. He lived and worked in Southwark in I think the 19th century. So I read that, and it was great because it was a slim pamphlet for kids. So it just gave me the facts without me having to trawl too much. I was reading a lot of that sort of work. I'm trying to think what else.
What did it tell you though about that period? I mean, when you look at now, where virtually nothing we deal with is in paper. I mean, I love I'm a bibliophile, so I mean, and you can see that already from our talk earlier. But so I have to have books, but when you go back and you see that this kind of, I mean, in a way, I guess you really see the collective...
The political moment of the time,
And the fact that it was collective action. Like, people were going in the school with these crazy... I mean, I remember, because I'm old enough to remember these mimeograph machines and this blue ink of, you know, turning, and copies that were done by hand and then distributed to children. And without... I mean, just with the compunction of saying, you know, this information needs to be out there. What did it...
I mean, it definitely
make you
spoke
feel
to
like
the ephemeral nature of today. One thing that was super interesting was, because I had some links with people who had been involved in anti-racist activism in the 80s, I would sometimes find information in the British Library, and then just through the networks that I had, I'd talk to other people about it, and then they would be like, oh yeah, so-and-so is involved in that, and then that so-and-so would send me a pamphlet, which would then like provide more details and more perspective to it. And one of those pamphlets in particular that I got sent was it detailed from a teachers' union the fact that police started going into schools and there were some incidences of like extreme harassment of black children, and I wrote about that in the book, and I figured this is all you know on the public record, even though it's not part of the country's understanding of itself. You know, this information was out there, although it was 30 years ago. And about a year ago, I actually started looking for the person who had been harassed by the police, because I figured that he'd be in his 40s now if it happened when he was 11 years old. So I looked around for him, looked on the electoral register so I could see if I could get an original interview with him. Couldn't find him. Anyway, about a year ago, one of his relatives reached out and they said, I can't believe that I've just read this story in your book. That person was my brother. My family never really spoke about it. My brother was traumatized, all of this stuff. Can you send me the research that you did to dig up that story? And so I've sent her copies of it and everything. And I thought that was amazing that I was able to do that.
Yeah.
And I think now, being a person who, you know, has a presence on social media and also follows lots of people who are active now.
Absolutely.
There's an ephemeral nature, which means that sometimes I feel like I log on and people are talking about stuff and I'm not even quite sure what they're talking about. And sooner or later, like, the tweets will stay up, but there's no clear reference. And I think it's a real shame. So I'm very grateful to those union activists and, you know, the organizations like the New and Monitoring Project. When I was writing the book, I was busy trying to get in contact with them because I knew that they were still going. And then I learned that they'd like collapsed due to funding a year prior. Otherwise, I would have spoken to them
directly.
All of that documentation was so integral into making that first chapter what it is. And I feel that culture definitely needs to be revived.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things too that's was really powerful for me reading the book was reading this history. I actually was in London in the late 80s, but it was really fantastic to read about what was happening around me at the same time, and to kind of have more of a historical record, because, I mean, you bring up in the book, which is quite appropriate, this idea that you know more about like Black American history and characters of history than Black British history. And as a Black American, for me, you know, I wanted to know more about your history, because I've lived in London for many years, and I know snippets of it, but it was really the first time, or one of the first time, where I was compelled to say, okay, you know, let's get down in it and really kind of have a look in, and also, you know, to see the parallels, because, I mean, this is the thing that is most stunning about it, is the fact that you're recounting the story like of this 11-year-old boy that was traumatized. I mean, that's something that carries over to all geographies where people of African descent are. So, and it sort of takes the gloss in a way off of this idea that is still very prevalent in Black America, that Europe is, you know, this sort of liberal, open, high consideration space, because it's talking about a historical period, a very historical period. But it was really important, I think, to, as a Black American, to have that information. And I think it's underestimated how much we want to know. And I think it's really important that books like yours are present in the discourse, because you know, 20% of the American population carries a passport.
Yeah, I'm aware.
So, you know, the only way that a lot of people are going to travel is through books. So
well, I really appreciate this line of questioning, because, you know, I think this may be the first time, and the book came out in English almost 2 years ago, that I've been asked any detailed questions about any of the historical research that I did for this book. Like, it's never asked. I mean, people might ask, well, how did you go about doing it? Where did you go? And I'll be like, Well, I went to the British Library.
It's like there's 5 places where you would,
and I went to the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, and I asked around, like, people who I knew who'd been involved in activism and had links, and that was it, and that's where the questioning ends. But nobody really asked any detailed questions, and that was one of the most challenging parts of the book for me. You know, I'm not a historian, and also trying to find people and ask around and get these obscure pamphlets that were published 30 years ago that, like, one man in his 70s had in his attic, and he sent it to me in the post. You know, like all of that stuff was really that was a huge challenge for me, and
it also must have been hard to read.
Oh, hugely hard to read. I find it, like, really at this point tiring, I think, to have to sit down and discuss my book, and people focus so much on the political arguments that come at the end of the book and nothing about the context that I try to build to make those political arguments. It's just so tiring at this point. So thank you.
No, thank you. No, I mean, I think it's really important because it's, the thing is that there is a kind of erasure that happens and that has happened, and as a consequence, there's an assumption that these materials are not available, that people can't access them, and that the historical record is not representing the demands that people of African descent are putting forward. I mean, these are long, very tiresome, very troubling, destructive processes, and just for their own well-being, they had to be documented.
Absolutely.
So the fact that it's assumed that it's not accessible because, again, we're in this sort of, you know, independent mainstream kind of discussion. But, I mean, everywhere in Europe in this particular period of time, much of activism was kitchen table.
Absolutely. I tell you another thing.
Tell me.
I've also got some pushback from older generations about going through that history and pulling it out from the archives, and I thought it was super interesting that for some it was so traumatic that they didn't want to go over it. I thought it was very fascinating because whilst I can absolutely understand that stance, that also leads to the erasure where the work is never on the agenda. That information is not in the British curriculum, and then you lead to find yourself in 2017 where people are like, well, we've never really had a problem like that here.
Yeah, exactly. Can you still hear me? Yeah. No, I mean, that's the thing, is that it's, and I think this is a discussion also with young activists. I mean, I think you had this also in one of your podcasts where young activists of color and of African descent are having to really work to get, I'm one of them, so I call it old schoolers, in the conversation so that, you know, like Toni Morrison has a quote that says, you know, somebody didn't tell somebody something.
Well, this is the thing.
And so that, you know, that the only way it's going to happen is if these kinds of conversations, and that conversations with activists who were really involved, because I think also there has to be, you know, in as far as we have these tools of technology and so on, you know, I come from a generation, again, that says, you know, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. So you have to have strategies that are untrackable. The only people that know that are people that were in those struggles before, because they didn't have cell phones, because they had to figure out other ways to stay in touch, stay networked, and find spaces to ensure that the information was kept but also distributed. And that, you know, because you talk about in I think it was the White Season, we talked with a South Asian activist who was part of the Black Panthers.
Oh, yeah. Farouk Dondi is his name, yeah.
Farouk Dondi, and he talks about basically the attack on black bookshops, because he was living above a black bookshop. So, you know, there's an awareness that this is very, it's very incendiary to have places where this kind of information is readily available to the public. and particularly to the public of African descent and people of color. So I think that conversation really needs to happen, and it's really great that you start to build that in discussion on your podcast with young activists now who are also open to it, because I mean there's a lot of people, many people, for example, in the Black Lives Matter movement have said, you guys did that and that's fabulous, and you're the platform and you're the foundation on how we move forward, but we really need to look at this in a different way, and we need to look at it take a different approach, and that's fair enough. I mean, I think
definitely,
that's
as long as we don't chuck the baby out with the bathwater,
exactly.
Because then you're just reinventing the wheel every 30 years.
Yeah, to no avail.
Yeah.
Yeah, to no avail. Give me a time.
10 to 9, so...
Okay. We go back to now the reader question. Were you thinking about readers?
Oh, when I was writing the book, really no.
Yeah.
No. I think right from the beginning of the journey of the book, right at proposal stage, I was being told, well, who's going to read it? And I was like, I don't know, people like me.
Exactly. Yeah, because there's a difference between a reader and an audience. That's a different thing.
Who's your ideal reader? I was like, I'm not a marketer, guys. It's not something I really concern myself with. And post the publication of the book, I've also been dogged by this question, well, who do you want to read it? Who's it for? And I'm like, whoever picks it up, honestly. I think that sometimes there's this, I always say, there's this a feeling, there's a type of calculation attributed to me and this piece of work that didn't really exist. I'm just I just wanted to write the book that I'd like to read, I had a strong vision of what it would be in my head, and I tried to build it to that, but I didn't really think too much about who was going to read it. And that's going to, at this point, be a question that I can never answer, and readers can debate it amongst themselves, but it's honestly out of my hands. Yeah. I mean, I'm not at the till when people are buying it, so...
Exactly. How did it feel when you went from this sort of post to being asked to write a book? Because I mean, had you always? Can you hear me? Have you always? Had you seen that as a book, or had you just said, okay, I wrote this post and I'll carry on with my life. I'll keep writing my journalism stuff. How did you react when a publisher came to you? Because most people are running around trying to get publishers.
Yeah, I mean, an agent approached me, and my understanding is that he didn't know about the original blog post, actually.
Wow.
Yeah, he wasn't aware.
Amazing.
It was after I had something published in the New York Times.
Okay.
So he wasn't aware. I have always enjoyed writing. I've always been a writer, since I was a child. But then, when I was becoming an activist, I was writing alongside it. And sometimes, people have asked me, well, were you trying to be a blogger? Were you trying to be an activist? I was like, this was all part and parcel. It was all in the...
one big package.
Exactly. And so after I wrote that blog post and it took off, I was trying to forge a career in doing anti-racist journalism, and it wasn't very successful because the newspapers weren't interested. So when the book opportunity came by and this agent reached out and said, have you thought about writing a book? I was like, well, it wouldn't be anything but anti-racist writing, because this is what I was trying to do anyway with my work, largely unsuccessfully.
But you say in your letter, you talk about what it took to actually do that kind of writing. Can you expand on that a little bit? I'm not asking you to tell some, horrific story or anything, but I mean, in terms of what it took, what process you had to go through to get that material more foregrounded, because you do consider yourself an anti-racist journalist. How does that manifest in terms of the path you had to take to get there?
Well, I mean, bluntly put, I was living on the poverty line for 6 years. I literally had no money. Like, I barely had any money to pay my rent, and my writing was used as window dressing by British magazines and newspapers who were interested in having one black person say one thing on a freelance basis once every 4 months. So I couldn't afford to live, like, bluntly put.
Yeah.
Even when I was writing the book, it was difficult, you know. I got a modest advance. It was difficult. And there were times when I was writing the book, like, where, like, I remember the first draft that I wrote, which I sat at my kitchen table and tried to, like, just get it all out of my head over the course of a month. Like, I couldn't afford to put the heating on. So that's what I mean by, like, literal sacrifice. Yeah. That's why I'm living good now. I don't care.
Hey, don't get it twisted.
Like,
yes,
I literally, like,
yes.
I call it payment in lieu.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. No,
I'm like, well, I
absolutely.
earned nothing for about 6 years, so I'm going to buy those trainers.
Yeah. Absolutely.
If you spread out the royalties, it's actually a modest salary over that course of time, you know.
No, it's real. It's real.
I mean, honestly, if you looked at my tax returns, you're like, how is this person living?
Yeah.
And that's why I'm also like, I think, in terms of this boom that we're seeing, I think particularly in Britain, where, like, all these publications now, I think partly due to the success of my book, are like publishing more writing. I'm very bitter. Because I'm like, wow, I mean, you really just move with the times, don't you? None of you are willing to lead. Yeah. One thing that I will say with Bloomsbury is that, you know, who published the book in English was that I definitely felt that Bloomsbury were willing to lead a conversation on this, not follow, not do a imitation title, but really lead. And that's why I worked with them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it's also real to say as well, I mean, I remember when, for example, Ben Ockery won the Booker, and everyone was like, oh, you know, it's fabulous. And it's an amazing book. But he was homeless for most of the time he was writing that book. And so the assumption was that, you know, he'd just, you know, been hidden away writing. But, you know, he talked about, you know, that's why I understand a lot more than what you're reading about living in the world.
Absolutely. And I think it's the sacrifices that one has to make in order to prioritize writing and, like, really go in hard on it, because I knew if I had chosen to go and get a 9-to-5 job, you know, I was a bright graduate, it was an option, but I chose not to do it because I knew this was going to take over my life and writing would be deprioritized. And so I was, in terms of a person with responsibilities, I was in a relationship, but I didn't have children. You know, I wasn't in a position where people were relying on me and I could bring down my, you know, cost of living to nothing, cycle everywhere, take a packed lunch, don't involve myself in social events because I couldn't afford to be there. And that was what, I did that for years and years and years in order to try and get my writing off the ground. And, you know, I hear from friends who had, when their first novels were published, they were like, yeah, I mean, I wrote that, like, literally on my phone on the commute to work, you know, because there was no other time in my life to do it. And so it's strange to see people, like, romanticize the writing process, because, like, in this real world, what you actually have to do to make that time is astonishing. That's why I feel very, very lucky that I can, if I want to, take a week and just focus on writing. And I'm like, that is such a privilege.
But you earned it, my dear.
Oh, yeah, like I say, payment in lieu.
Exactly. I know you're a fiction reader, which I find really interesting, because when I find that nonfiction writers are fiction readers, it always strikes me. But I'm wondering, how's your approach to storytelling as a nonfiction writer impacted by the fact that you read fiction? Like, how does that relationship between this sort of the two forms?
I think it's influenced by fiction and journalism. So you mentioned the podcast, and for me, the structure of the podcast was like putting together a newspaper feature, in terms of how
that's true. That's how it listens.
In terms of how it flowed, and that's what I love to listen to or watch when it comes to nonfiction. But in terms of reading nonfiction, I've never really liked it. I find it terribly dull. I feel like nonfiction from journalists, like there's no personality. Nonfiction from academics is littered with subheadings, which gives you a wonderful excuse to just put the book down and return to it never. So I just, I like nonfiction with good writing behind it, I'm actually reading a great nonfiction book at the moment. It's not out yet, but it's called The Ungrateful Refugee by a writer called Dina Nayeri. And it's based on a long read that she wrote for The Guardian that was just like pulsing with personality and passion. And that's what I really need my nonfiction to read like. And those pointers also come from fiction, I suppose, I appreciate journalism for telling a good story, and I appreciate fiction for telling a good story. And sometimes I feel like non-fiction books miss a mark, I guess, And when I was writing the I knew I first off didn't want any subheadings, and I didn't want like a title and then an extra bit of title at the end, because I was like, that's a turn off. Like the title and then a longer title that explains the fuller title. Yeah. It's like, you should be able to get it.
Exactly. Just have to work a little bit harder to get it down to where it needs to be.
Exactly. I also really wanted it to flow. I wanted it to flow and feel unput-downable in terms of, I wanted it to feel absorbing and unput-downable, rather than, and now I will go on to this topic, And I don't think that is impossible when it comes to nonfiction. Yeah. I don't think it's impossible. I don't know, does my fiction reading influence my non-fiction writing? I don't know if I've given it much thought, but I do remember having a great conversation with my editor when it came to some of the stats that fill the book in that chapter, the system, and we were talking about how to make them into a story. Yeah. So that they would land, rather than just feeling like, stat after stat after stat. Yeah. And you just read all these numbers and they have no meaning to you after a while. And I do like to tell stories, but I'd rather not make them up. Yeah, exactly. And you can tell stories from the truth.
Yeah, and I think you were successful in, taking us on this journey of the statistical aspect of what you were trying to inform us about, that made you kind of a hungry reader. You were moving really, they were constructed in such a compelling manner that it meant that you wanted to know what happened to those people. You started with something, but you were pushed along based on the fact that in a very short amount of time, you became very concerned about them, and you wanted to know what happened to them. And I think that was really a beautiful aspect of the book in telling such retelling such horrific experiences of people.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it was really, really well done.
I'll take that as a compliment, but don't get too upset because it was hypothetical. It's a hypothetical person.
No, but I mean the people that you actually
absolutely. I think similarly, like there's sometimes an issue that I find with nonfiction, and even with nonfiction that I like, which is when it tries to zoom out to tell that stat, it just feels like it's been added in a bit, like it's clunky. It's like an amazing, like perhaps sometimes first person of an experience, and then a quick zoom out, and 37% of people also experience this, which so it's a challenge to avoid that, I guess.
What do you like about podcasting?
Well, I was a podcast listener, and I loved listening to podcasts. I don't know what the podcast scene is like here, but in the UK, it's kind of young, and I found that it was just basically full of two people bantering, like, so you just like listen in on
It's
some
a
people having
rock'em sock'em
fun.
robots.
Yeah, two people bantering and you're like pretending that they're your friend. But for me, I enjoyed those, but I also really enjoyed like factual, almost documentary type journalist-led podcasts that were coming out from the US. And so when embarking on my own, which...
Sorry. Technical difficulties.
I don't know what's going on there.
No,
Can you still hear me? Yeah. In terms of like embarking on my own, first off, it wouldn't have been something that I would have done if I was being hounded by a couple of documentary producers they wanted to turn why I'm into like television documentary, and I was like, I have no desire to be on television. Like, do you understand? Like, I do not want to be on television. And then, but I was interested in exploring a documentary format. So I was like, I think it's actually a good idea to tell some stories and explore some things, but I don't really want my face to be like on television. Also, you lose creative control. And after writing a whole book where your editor checks in on you once every 6 months, like I was like, there's no way I can work with people who are like, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? So I was like, okay, well, let me give it a try in documentary form. And also like a great producer had reached out to me. And it also involved loads of writing. I wrote like all of these scripts. And I wanted to create a podcast that I would listen to. And well, I think I did that. The only issue is it was even more, I suppose the business term is granular. Like writing the podcast scripts were even more granular than writing a book, because at least when I was writing the book, I could like sit back and read the writing and appreciate it for as a whole at the end of every paragraph, at the end of every chapter. But with writing the podcast scripts, I got so focused on how sound was going to take over and where was this going to overlap.
And the cuts and the fade outs, the fade ins and stuff. And
I'd give it to people to listen to, and they'd be like, wow, that content's fascinating. And what that person said was really interesting. And I was like, yeah, but I think their voice was too quiet. Like, or do you think I should move the music here, there, or whatnot? And so I did get like a little too granular with it. Yeah.
No, but I like the way it's put together. It has I also like how you fade. I mean, fading is a real skill. And when someone's talking and you're moving to the next thing, you're really, personally, I feel that the flow of it and the way that you kind of move, for it to be something that you're listening to, it's actually very dynamic.
That's
and
amazing.
That's really,
Thank you.
Really enriching as a listener, because you're talking to so many different people that are coming from different orientations in terms of the subject matter. That I'm talking specifically about political blackness and the 2 white season episodes.
So those episodes,
because I feel that they were. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to go on the website.
Yeah, it's free. It's free. It's called About Race with Reni Eddo-Lodge.
It's really it's a good listen. And so I think that because you were dealing with so many different characters who are very well known, they have very clear kind of positionings. That was really important, how you could move them in and out in a fluid way, so that the listener understood where they fit in the frame of what you're discussing. Yeah,
I was that granular that I literally wrote fade in the script.
Yeah, but you have to do that.
I didn't give my producer creative control over where that she could or couldn't fade. And that's why I say it was like writing a newspaper feature, but even more intense, because what I really wanted to do with those episodes was get the interviews to tell the story, the story in a chronological way, as well as make the arguments. Yeah. And I thought that it would be a great opportunity to hear from lots of interesting people with expertise. And at that point as well, I was tired of talking about my work. So I was like, let's just and having been involved in anti-racism and writing for some time, like I was already aware of all these interesting people and wanted to call on them for their expertise. So yeah, I was very I remember painstakingly going through, highlighting everything, every interview, highlighting everything that I thought was interesting, and then literally knitting excerpts of each interview together in order to make those scripts. It was intense.
Yeah, but it's good work. It's really good work.
Thank you.
We reference back to the letter a bit. What books, as a reader, have made you evangelical in terms of, during and, well, probably not during, but after writing your book? Is there a book now that you're pushing into people's hands?
I keep shouting about a book called When I Hit You by a writer named Mina Kandasamy.
Okay.
It's literary fiction, and it's probably the best account of domestic violence I've ever read. It recounts like a short 4-month-long marriage that she had with a man who publicly was left-wing but privately was an abusive misogynist, and it was just the best. Right, I think that like domestic violence, rape, sexual abuse is so often sensationalized or used as some kind of like plot device to like illustrate some kind of moment in someone's life, and I just thought that it was such an incredible piece of writing from a woman about a time period that didn't define her, and that like you don't come away feeling like traumatized and or sorry for the protagonist. You're just like, I would definitely love to be that person's friend, and you feel angry with our protagonist about the ways that she's been treated. And for me, this is a kind of a bit of a spoiler, I suppose, but for one of the most disturbing things in it was not like the rapes or the sexual assaults, but the fact that the abusive husband tried to stop our protagonist from forging a writing career and like attempted to really sabotage that. And I was like, this is too much.
You've gone too far.
Too far. I hate this guy.
It's real.
Because that was like trying to exert a real ultimate control. It was a really fantastic book. I would recommend it a lot. I always talk to people about it. I'm also shouting about Dina Nayeri's book. It's not out yet, but it's a work of nonfiction. And she wrote this Guardian long read, which is so great.
You said The Ungrateful
Refugee?
The
Ungrateful Refugee. The Guardian long read is still available. And like one of the lines that really sticks with me, and like it's not often that I read a line and I'm like, I've got to take a note of that. That was fire. The line was that civilized people don't ask for CVs when answering calls from the edge of a grave. I just thought it was an incredible line. And the book's shaping up to be amazing as well.
Wow.
So,
goodness me.
I'm trying to think, what else am I evangelical about? And those are two writers who happen to be women, probably because I only read women, whose work I'm really enjoying. I do read men, but they're the minority guys. Trying to think what else. I think, those are the two I'd shout about at the moment.
Okay. What are you doing to keep your balance in the process of all of this, since this, from the blog post? And I mean, my sense is always there has to be a kind of support and a strategy of ordering yourself in, because when I started reading your book, I was thinking about where I was at 24, and I was at university in Berkeley, and to think that at 24 you've written your blog post and you're soon going to be writing a book that's now being translated. And I sort of saw myself as really carefree, but there are a lot of things that come into play once that change happened. Yes, you've obviously had to do a lot of work to get here, but I guess in a selfish way, it's kind of like I'm asking the question because I want to make sure you keep writing.
Yes. The $1 million question.
So, I mean, I mean, I hope it's not an overly personal question, but it's just, I think, important to know that those things are happening as well, not just the tours and the book signings, but also that, we have a little bit a surety that, she's good.
I mean, what have I been doing? Let me tell you. I wasn't doing very well for a long time. It's really only in the last 3 months that I've started to write again, that I've actually started to have a relationship with my writing again. Because obviously it was like, I don't know, I'd say obviously. Is it obvious? I don't know. It was at first profoundly confusing and overwhelming for me to, my writing, something that would be very personal for me for a very long time.
Absolutely.
Suddenly I was faced with a bunch of people who were like, well, we own this now.
Yes.
We've got opinions.
Yes.
This is ours. This is my book. And I was like, huh?
Yeah.
Then I was like, do I need to fight these people for ownership of my work? I don't. And then I was like, wait, no, I guess you did all that publicity, so people know about you now. So that was profoundly strange, and it will never not be strange to me to accept. I still haven't accepted that I've lost an element of my anonymity, particularly around where I live. I live where my readers live. I can't go to a cafe and meet a friend on the evening or weekend without somebody coming to interrupt, and I'm like, wow, I really sold my anonymity. Wow, why did I do that to myself? That took me a long time to accept. And also, I think for as long as I have lived, I always wanted to write. I always wanted to write for a living. But nobody warns you that if your writing's successful, you're going to have to do a lot of stuff that's not writing. You're just going to have to fit it in around the things that are required of you to be a public-facing writer. And I, recently was discussing this with a fashion designer. By the way, it's taken me 18 months to reckon with these questions. But I was recently discussing this with a fashion designer who, has this tiny, small fashion house with a staff of less than, 10 in East London, and she dresses people like Olivia Colman. And whenever I went to her studio, she'd be working till 11 p.m. And I said, when do you design the clothes? And she was like, you just have to fit it in. You just have to fit it in around the logistics and organising photo shoots. And that conversation really struck me. Now, I'm not saying I work as hard as her, not by any means.
It's a different
well, it's a different type of work for sure. But it just struck me then that I have to prioritize that time or it doesn't happen. And I think sometimes, and it's certainly for the first year, the answering the emails and the requests for the events, which initially I was like, but I wrote the book, why do you need me there to talk about it? Surely it says everything that I wanted to say. Apparently not. People want to see you, so and all of the stuff that comes from having a successful book was becoming my job. And then I was
instead of writing.
But when I started to write again, and this is super recently, 2019, I was like, this is literally the best part. The best part of the job. And so I feel very fortunate that I get to do that. And there's a possibility that other people might read it and that I might be paid. That's very exciting. And it's been a real learning curve to me to have to accept that if I want to keep writing for a living, I have to prioritize that over anything else.
Absolutely.
And that does sometimes mean disappointing people. And sometimes that means cancelling things or saying to people, which, often happens, I work with an amazing agent who, now that I basically am doing a hard no to any more requests on my time, she'll say, sorry, Reni, can't come to this event, can't come to that event. But then sometimes people sort of catch me at events and they're like, oh, I wanted to see you here, there, or can you come to our thing? And particularly because the book is so political, activists reach out a lot, and it means disappointing people and saying, I'm sorry, like, I believe in what you're doing, I'm trying to protect my time so that you can perhaps have another book in a few years' time. So,
and that's your job.
Well,
that is your job, is writing.
Yeah, that is the core of the job, even though all these other things like pop up around it, like that's an absolute core of it. And for a long time, I was like mourning the life that I had prior to book publication, because the life that I had endless time to write. Nobody was interested in me. So I had like endless time to write, and it was wonderful. But now people are interested, and so I'm like, oh, okay, well, this is new. But, you know, like the fashion designer said, you just fit it in.
Yeah, you just fit it in. You just fit it in. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think, Reni, thank you so much. Thank you for the time and for wonderful answers and really thoughtful engagement in this process. And I look forward to seeing you on Sunday.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
There is some time left for Q&As, but preferably it's a question and not a comment. So.
Oh, come on, you guys.
What's the thing that's most changed in your life since becoming a successful author?
Well, the most immediate thing is like the balance in my bank account. Like, in terms of,
I heard that.
In terms of like, literally not having to worry about bailiffs. Like, that's the immediate thing. But then I think a slower paced thing has been having to accept that my book means a lot to people. That's been something that's been profoundly like mind-blowing to me, I think. And that seemed to happen very quickly, as soon as the book came out. And it was a huge shock to me because I was used to, you know, I live in London, I'd walk around with, you know, anonymity, but a month after the book came out, people were coming up to me in train stations, and I was like, I don't talk to strangers, like I live in London, like what's going on? And then they whip out a copy of the book, so that was profoundly confusing and first off very uncomfortable, but now I kind of I accept it and I can anticipate it and I know what the face the like facial expression looks like. If I walk into somewhere and like someone starts smiling at me, I'm like, they probably read the book, I think. So
that's great.
Did you struggle with the translation of the title? Because it's quite a strong title in English, but changing into different languages isn't always the same meaning. Yeah,
I mean, well, I didn't personally translate it. I'm only fluent in one language, so it wasn't my personal struggle. But I really sympathise with translators who have to work out how each word is going to land, and not just a different language, but a different culture. But also, I think, for me, coming from a background of journalism where, like, you file your copy and you don't choose the title of your work, I am not actually that attached to any of the titles of any of the editions. It was actually my editor who came up with the title, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. She said, well, why don't you just call it the same thing as your blog post? Like, at proposal stage, that's not what the book was called. Similarly, I think, you know, the direct translation of the French edition, which is Racism is a White Problem, I think that would be suited to the English edition as well. So each time I've been like, yeah, cool, seems cool. seems fine to me. I don't feel hugely attached. And this sort of links into your question as well. It's my readers who are very attached. So then they're like, Reni, it's changed. And I'm like, yeah, I know. No, we don't like it. I'm like, oh, I guess in terms of like the grand scheme of things, I was focused a lot on the content of the book and less on the title. So yeah, it surprised me.
How do you react when you get confronted? Sorry.
Where are
Here.
you?
Stand up.
Hi.
How do you react when you get confronted with people who deny racism or structural racism, or go into deep discussions with you to deny or whatever? Yeah.
Do you do deep discussions like
I
that?
avoid
Or do you? I mean, it's a title why you no longer talk to people, but when it happens, what do you say? Because I guess some readers, or I will talk for myself, get confronted with these people, and I wonder how you react or how you could make a suggestion.
I mean, I do really, really work hard to avoid people who don't believe that structural racism exists. Really hard. In terms of like, I'm in the UK, I'm often approached, well, I was until I changed all my contact details. I was often approached by like television and news producers who thought that because I'd written this book, I now wanted to be like a public talking head to go on and argue with like people from the far right on TV and yell and scream. And I was like, no, I don't think I want to do that. I'll pass. Like, I enjoy writing. That's the bit that I want to do. So I really try hard to avoid that. And, you know, the second line of that original blog post is not all white people, just the vast majority who refuse to accept the legitimacy of structural racism and its symptoms. I know that off by heart at this point. Meaning that I'm interested in talking to people who are open and curious, but the hostility and the defensiveness, I work hard to avoid. Like, and sometimes, because of the book that I've written, people see me as a beacon, as somebody who can come over, they can come over to and start having that conversation. I just make my excuses and leave. I do. There was one time at an award ceremony where a young woman who I had the unfortunate luck of speaking to simply because of an acquaintance who had a feminist podcast. This woman was a listener, and then suddenly she left, and I was left with this person, and she was like, starting to interrogate me, and I was like, her interrogation started with, well, there's a black girl at my work. And at that point, I knew that her workplace couldn't have been diverse if there was the black girl.
Right, so you already heaped it.
And she said, yeah, this black girl at my work, like, she really offended me by saying that she's worked harder than the rest of us to be at that workplace. And I just think that's not fair. She's wrong. And I said, statistically, she's right. Statistically, she's right. And then I just gathered my things. I said, well, it was nice to chat, and I left. Because I just left it at that. So I tried really hard. Like, I meant what I wrote in that blog post in terms of, like, I cannot have that conversation anymore. And when people try to drag me into it, I'm just like, well, good to talk to you. And I just bounce. So
Exactly.
I recognize, though, for my readers that it can be difficult, and I encourage them to draw that same boundary. I do.
Yes. People should do it more.
I had a similar question, but in the meantime, I got a new question.
Okay.
Well, that's good. Adaptable.
I know it isn't always easy to have the image of the black female writer, because it has a lot of how do I say? People have a lot of expectations. Now you are the voice for something. Now you are that personality. Now you are that writer. Does it bother you sometimes that people see you as that way, like a voice now? Like the image, you know, it takes away from your personality, I presume.
Yes, it bothers me a lot. I feel objectified.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's why I ask, because it's very common, I feel.
I struggle a lot with and this is from people who are fans of the work, but sometimes there's a sense of entitlement over me as a human being, which I really don't like. I really don't like it. And I don't know what more I can say. It seems to be now part and parcel of the job, doesn't it? So, I try hard to avoid. I was in Berlin last night talking about the book, and the reading was over capacity. There were people outside who couldn't get in, and there was a screen outside, and the Q&A then turned into people saying, we couldn't get in, you should come and speak to people outside. And I was like, I'm not a public resource, guys. Like, at this point, I've done 4 interviews in a day, and now I've done an hour and a half talk, and like, yes, I'd like to meet people, but you can't chop me up into small pieces and hand me out. Like, so I really despise the sense of feeling objectified as a writer, and I like reluctantly have to accept that this is what happens when lots of people take to your work. I don't know what more else to say about that. I really don't like it. Sometimes I'm like, if I'd written under a pseudonym, then people would have been able to still read the same work without feeling ownership over me as a person. It is what it is. So.
That said, perhaps just one more, because then we can wrap it up. And Reni didn't have dinner yet, so
it's
she
fine.
wants to
I'm not hungry.
So one more question, and then it's time for book signing.
Hi. First of all, I also have a question, but I also really wanted to thank you for your book. I think it's the best book I ever read, and I think it was just so eye-opening, and I think it should be obligatory literature for everyone. And so thank you, first of all.
Thank
and
you.
Secondly, I was wondering, because now, if I understand correctly, you're doing a European tour, and the book focuses mainly on where you're from the UK. Do you see any particular or differences with readers from European countries or from Belgium or Berlin or that are different from people from the UK?
The thing with touring is that you don't get to spend that much time in any place that you go to. Like, I spend less than 24 hours in each city, so I couldn't give any sort of educated answer on like what the similarities and differences are. I know what my readers tell me. I think particularly in like cities on the continent in particular, people always say, it's much worse here, Reni, it's much worse. London is utopia compared to what we're dealing with. And so I believe them. Like I say, I'm not that hungry, so go ahead.
Thank you, Reni, for the talk, and thank you to the lady to my left for encouraging me to ask a question. Yes. Thank you, Reni, for the talk, and thank you to the woman to my left for encouraging me to ask a question as a woman of color. I wanted to ask, regarding your book, it's all about anti-racist activism. I haven't read it yet, but that's what I'm assuming from your talk. I wanted to ask, any talks or speaking engagements that you're invited to, how do you make the decision to take that offer? Especially considering what your book is about. Like, do you go to any country or any city, or do you kind of pick and choose for yourself why this institute, or question why this institute or festival wants to invite you, and under what terms, and all that stuff? Like, what are your, like, criteria? Yeah. Thank you.
An excellent question.
Thank you.
Okay, I mean, it's a good question. I prioritize book spaces, literary spaces, because usually they have the infrastructure to provide the book. That's like a logistical thing. And what I found when I've done talks in places that aren't book spaces or literary spaces, they don't. And then people come up to me, they're like, where can I get it? Why aren't there any here? So that's, it's kind of a boring answer. But also I get asked a lot of things. I get asked to do a lot of things. And so I prioritize, I don't really do anything in the UK anymore. I prioritize book things abroad, where I feel I can like meet readers like outside of my sort of London bubble. That's pretty much it. I mean, I also like don't really take invitations from countries that like do literary festivals as like cultural fig leaves for like oppressive regimes. They're not that keen on inviting me to their events though anyway, so. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
One follow-up question. That makes perfect sense. And then what do you do when you sense that people will kind of use the book and use what you represent as a way to kind of goed praten, van condone what they're doing, even if condone their practices, condone their festival, condone everything that they're doing because you're appearing, sort of like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And my answer to that is that, like, in terms of what I can control, that's not one of the things I can control. I attend events on the basis that I'm not being reached out in bad faith, I suppose. And as I'm often asked about how I feel about how my book is received, or whether or not I think white people in particular, are reading it correctly, or, who do I think deserves to read it, or am I in the right space, and all these things in terms of how the political arguments are landing. Like, for my own personal mental peace of mind, like, I have to start from a position of it's coming from why I'm being asked to participate is coming from a good place. I think the nature of the sort of book that I've written is that because the subject matter is spoken about so rarely, people who have been marginalized from that space come into the space with a lot of anger about feeling marginalized, and my book is seen as the, what's the word? Lightning rod for the conversation more broadly about why people are upset with the institution. It happens loads of times, and I'm just sat there like, okay, well, this conversation will happen, so that's okay. It doesn't matter that I wanted to talk about the book. It's okay, it's fine. And if that needs to happen in like organizations and institutions because I appeared, and trust me, it happens loads. Like, I can think of half a dozen events that, I was scheduled to speak about my book, and everyone turned, like, there was one at the British Museum, like, everyone turned up and they were like, we are sick and tired of this institution, and we are here to talk about how this institution marginalizes black museum workers. So I was like, okay, that's cool. Well, we'll have that conversation. It doesn't matter, because if my book event is the event in which that conversation is going to be had, then that's fine. So that's cool. It's out of my hands, you know. I've written a book that lands in a political atmosphere where it hasn't been spoken about for a very long time. Well, I don't know. I don't want to sound egotistical, but it does feel like there's a
conversation is percolating.
Exactly. So sometimes that happens, and I would hope that, like, me appearing with my book exists, like, perhaps, like, is a catalyst for those broader conversations to be had with the institutions that invite me, Like, that happened in Berlin yesterday. Yeah. Everyone was angry with the institution, so I was there stressed out because I was like, I just arrived here 4 hours ago, and here I am. And there's stress and people angry at the institution, but guess that's the life I signed up for. So,
Thank you all so much for the questions, Dory Wilson as well, and thank you so much, Reni, for your talk tonight.
Thank you, Dory.